In this video, you will hear Reddit scary stories about summer camping. Get ready. Turn on subtitles. We begin.
I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge. They had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc. and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about half a mile from the main camp, but we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, on this one night all the campers had made their shelters, we had cooked dinner, and were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music, but a lot of people, and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour. Sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that's what we had heard. This took place in the Australian bush around midnight. I was 17, leading a staggered column of about 60 cadets to our detachment campsite. Due to light discipline rules, only myself at the very front of the group and the other flight commander at the rear had torches on. This was so that any vehicles coming along the trail could see us, and so that most of the cadets could maintain their night vision. We were camouflaged up and thus difficult to see at night. As we walked along I periodically looked to my sides and kept seeing what looked like dewdrops on the ground, almost like tiny blue gems glinting in my torchlight at either side of the road. I had to maintain my position in the formation, so I couldn't get a good look at what they were. However, after a while we stopped for a very brief break and I took the opportunity to have a closer look. Walking over to the side of the trail I spotted a small cluster of the diamonds and focused my head torch on them. Rather than seeing diamonds or dewdrops or anything remotely pleasant, I instead saw a group of about 5 large spiders just crouching in the leaf litter and staring at me. They looked like huntsmen's, which are about the size of an adult's hand. Sweeping my head around, I realized there were thousands of those things. All over the ground, some on the trunks of trees, and everywhere around me, glaring at the light affixed to my head. I had a very brisk walk back to the formation and attempted to play it cool while screaming in my head. Being a massive arachnophobe, I have no effing clue how I managed to set up a tent and spend the next week in that cursed forest. My uncle used to have a cabin in the woods near Winter, Wisconsin on a relatively undeveloped arm of the Chippewa flowage. Not too remote that you couldn't pop into town for necessities, but far enough in the boonies that if you got hurt, you'd be in serious trouble. I used to spend time there in the summer tearing through the woods with my 2 cousins. One morning when I was about 10 my uncle woke us up roughly and told us it was time to go fishing. It was still super early and we were all confused because it was pitch dark and who the hell went fishing so early anyway. He hustled us down to the dock where he kept his little fishing boat and quickly launched us into the water and away from the house. At this point we were all getting a little freaked out by the weirdness of the situation. We thought maybe we were being punished because my uncle had gone to chop wood the previous morning and couldn't find his axe anywhere. He'd left it lodged in a stump next to the cabin and accused us of messing with it, which, to be fair, sounded like something we probably would have done. He ended up having to drive into town to buy a new one. He wasn't talking, though. We just sat shivering under a blanket at the bow of the boat while my uncle stared wild-eyed at the shoreline and waved a flashlight furtively ahead of us. We eventually arrived at my uncle's friend's cabin across the lake and tumbled into his house. Our uncle sent us to the loft to sleep and he and his buddy locked the doors and left, not returning until well after sunrise. Eventually our uncle showed up with a truck and trailer already packed with all of our gear and told us it was time to go home. We all thought it was weird that we were leaving the cabin days early, but we were kids, so we just went with it. My uncle was quiet for the whole long drive back to civilization. Many years later my uncle confided to me that the reason he'd hustled us home was because he'd woken up around 3 a.m. to a strange thok sound from outside the cabin. He'd gone out to investigate when a massive jack pine fell directly across the narrow driveway, locking us in. Startled by the noise, he swept his flashlight along the tree line just in time to see a man holding an axe slink away into the dark of the wood. He and his buddy had to take turns chainsawing the tree apart while the other stood watch with a rifle. He never found the axe. One day I was walking in the woods when I saw a blue tent, or what had once been a blue tent. It was torn to shreds and the poles were snapped, and it was all in a messy pile in the middle of a clearing. From a distance, it had looked like this clearing was full of cream-colored flowers, but as I got closer, I realized they were pieces of paper. Pages from Stephen King's The Shining, to be precise. They were charred around the outside, as though someone had set light to them, and the fact that they were individual made it look like someone had really wanted to destroy the book. I shrugged it off. It was a very neat setup for whatever project the film students from the nearby school would be making, I told myself. Very well done, guys, very creepy. It made the news shortly afterwards that a man from the next town over who had been missing for a long time had finally turned up, dead, in his blue tent in the woods. I don't know if he was still in there when I walked past. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. He was hiking with a friend who told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time, and all grabbed a kid and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, and afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. I was on a 15-hour bus trip from the Yucatan to Chiapas in Mexico with my family. It was late at night, and after several hours of driving we stopped at a gas station to go to the bathroom, grab snacks, etc. It would have been like any other trip, however I noticed there was an unusual amount of police. When we got back on the bus, the driver informed us that the police had received a tip that our bus was being targeted for a robbery by Mexican bandits. The police would escort us. We drove and drove for hours up a nauseatingly winding road on the side of a cliff. One police truck in front of us and one behind us, armed to the nines. I was on high alert, but after a while I dozed off. That was, until the bus came to an abrupt stop. I remember peering out the front window and seeing a series of large rocks placed strategically across the road. Everything was dark, except these rocks, being illuminated by the bus lights. If the police hadn't been there, this is most likely what would have went down. Step 1, bus driver disembarks, tries to remove rocks. Step 2, Mexican bandits kills the bus driver or holds hostage. Step 3, bandits board bus. Step 4, rob, RIP, kill. I was 17 years old, white-looking female, and I know what would have happened to me. Kidnapping for ransom would definitely not have been out of the question, and RIP a high guarantee. We were in the middle of nowhere on a mountain. If the police weren't there, I would not be here to tell this story. I was dating this girl from rural Maine. I mean really rural, western Maine, near the Appalachian Trail. I'm hanging out with her family one summer, shooting guns, shotgunning beers, and sharing hunting stories. One of the guys there starts talking about how he likes to hunt hikers on the trail. He said he would take pot shots with his rifle, messing up their campsites at night. Then he also claimed he came across this older woman camping a bit off the trail. Then he supposedly RIP'd her, made her write some fake note about how she starved, and then killed her. The other guys were laughing and backslapping him while I sat there drunk in total disbelief. I hope he was just bullshitting, but at the time I was glad I had a shotgun in my lap. I've contacted the Maine State Police and gave them all the info I had. They said they'd look into it.
Thank you for watching. What's the creepiest moment in history that hooked you? Share your reaction in the comments. Subscribe to not miss new stories.